Well, it's a pleasure to see a number of old friends here as well. And just a little addition to my introductory remarks. I am a native of Winchester. I went to Handley High School. I'm the oldest daughter of Charles and Pearl Lake Ebert. So that's always the big question, which Ebert is she? So get that covered from the beginning. I'm very grateful to Garland Quarles, who searched out so many details about John Handley. And in 1969, he published John Handley and the Handley Bequest to Winchester, Virginia. And the Historical Society has reprinted that, and we have those books available here for $10. And they also did a journal article that are all about Handley High School, which are also available for $10. So just in case you're so amazed by all these facts and details that you need to know more, you can do that. Not a problem. But John Handley was a pretty amazing guy. Some of you all may know we have Handley High School, we have Handley Library. How did we get those places? And who is John Handley? And what did he do to bring us all of this? Well, he wasn't really good he didn't leave a diary or any autobiographical sketches. He didn't even leave a big collection of correspondence or a photograph album. In fact, sometimes he gave us misinformation on different original or official forms, just depending on which one he was looking at. So we're lucky that good old Garland Quarles, who was a local historian, superintendent of the schools, did so much work and put together the story that we'll know who this grand benefactor was. Now, John Handley was born in Ireland on January 27th, 1835. So we're almost ready for his birthday party. He was the son of John and Elizabeth Handley in Enniscorthy, County Wexford in Ireland. And Enniscorthy is a small town in the southeastern section of the county. The town's grown a little bit since his day, but it's still a charming area. And a few years ago, I had a chance to visit Ireland, and I went to Enniscorthy. Everybody was saying what they wanted to do in Ireland, and I was like, Enniscorthy, I got to see where John Handley came from. So my traveling companions were very gracious about that, and we got to go see it. And I went by the library and gave them a copy of Garland Quarles' book and told them a little bit about what had happened with one of their natives who had come to Virginia and all that he had done. I did feel a tiny bit guilty. Their library was itty-bitty, and ours was really grand, but they seemed to take that in stride. And they seemed very interested in learning what had happened with one of their early citizens. So we also got a chance to go to St. Aidan's Cathedral, which is where he had been baptized. And so that was kind of fun. Now, Handley's father, John, was a carpenter, and he trained his son in that trade. And for his early education, he may have attended a parish school taught by a local priest. It was a difficult time. Education was not encouraged, certainly not by the English. They didn't really want to see too many of the Irish having opportunities to read and write. But the parish priests persevered. And John Handley was apparently very interested in education and did his best to learn as much as he could. Then, of course, they also had the potato famine, which happened in 1846 to 1851. Handley's father died in 1847. His younger sister died in 1850. So at the age of 15, Handley immigrated. And he went to Canada. Then later he appears in Rochester, New York, and he got his certificate of naturalization on October 24th, 1856. He worked as a carpenter, and he continued his self-education. He joined the Democratic Party. And after James Buchanan, who was a Pennsylvania Democrat, was elected president, then he moved to Washington, D.C., and accepted a position in one of the departments of government. He was about 23 when he made that trip. Now, Handley was described as being 6 foot 6 inches tall and weighing about 240 pounds. He stood very erect, had long black hair, always combed back behind his ears, a dark complexion with hazel eyes, pleasant features, a quite prominent chin, and a very high forehead. And one of his companions was also a tall young man, very striking, And the two of them were frequently invited to head all manners of parades on account of their towering forms and dignified bearing. So what fun would that be? You're in your mid-20s, you're in D.C., and now you're being asked to lead all these parades, and here you are, recently from Ireland. So he was having a grand time with it all. Around this time, he was also studying at the Law School of Columbia University, and in June 1860, he was signed to the role to practice as an attorney at the bar of the Circuit Court in District of Columbia. And he also met and married a rich widow. Is there any better kind? So, Mrs. Catherine Barnwell Livingston Thayer. She was from South Carolina, and she had a 12-year-old son, Philip, from her previous marriage. And Catherine and John were married in around 1857 or 1858, they believe in Philadelphia. So now he's married, has a ready-made family. He's now an attorney. So in 1860, he moved the family to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Why Scranton? Yes, it was a growing town. There was a lot going on there, and it seemed to be a good place, at least as far as Judge Handley was concerned. Well, he was just John at that time. He wasn't a judge yet. But there were some Handleys listed in the 1860 census, so maybe he had family there. He probably also saw the potential for investment. His records don't give any idea what drew him to that area. But on August 21st, 1860, he was sworn in and admitted to practice as an attorney at law in several courts in Lucerne County. And then, in another surprising twist, he served in the Union Army from April to July 1861 in the 8th Infantry Regiment, Company E. And his company made it to Winchester almost as close as Charlestown. And then he was mustered out. He was in one of those 90-day wonders, and when his 90 days were up, he was out of there. He was not inspired to continue on. In fact, in later terms, he was later well known for his sympathies with the Confederacy, so his service in the Union Army is a bit of a mystery, but he might have also figured it was good politics to do something like that, because then he began to build his legal practice, and he was employed as the legal consultant to the draft board, which was not always a popular thing to do, because at that time people were allowed to buy substitutes. And so part of his job was helping to negotiate for the substitutes, which might have been popular for those rich kids who didn't want to fight, but was not so popular with other people who then were drafted. And he began purchasing some real estate in around 1864, saving up his money, starting to invest. But unfortunately, things didn't go so well with his wife, and they separated in 1866, although he continued to support her and her son. Her son died in 1870, and in 1873, she petitioned the court for a divorce, which was granted, and then she moved back to Georgia, where she died in 1891. So he had sort of a short-lived romance. In the fall of 1874, at the age of 39, he won the Democratic nomination for judge in Lucerne County. It was a bitter political fight, but he was the victor by 289 votes. He served as a law judge until 1878, and then Lackawanna County was formed, and he was assigned as president judge of that county until 1885. He sought renomination, but he lost. He went as an independent, sort of split the vote. Wasn't such a good thing. Then the Republicans won. But at his retirement, he did receive a lot of accolades for his industry, courtesy, fairness, and professional spirit. They also have a portrait of his in the courthouse. So they couldn't consider him too bad because they kept his portrait, and it's still there. While he was in Scranton, he continued his purchases of real estate and his investments in business. He organized 4 banking institutions, was a controlling investor in the Lackawanna Improvement Company and the Pork Packing Company. Now, among his friends in Scranton, he had James Jifkins. With James, Mr. Jifkins moved to Frederick County in 1869, and a property that was known as Woodville. And Handley began to visit down here frequently. and he enjoyed meeting lots of good folks who were here. And he became friends with several prominent Winchester businessmen, among them Holmes Conrad, Governor Frederick Holliday, and Albert Baker. Holmes Conrad was a native of Winchester and had served in the Confederacy. After the war, he studied law in his father's office and was admitted to the bar. He became interested in politics and served in the Virginia House of Delegates. He had a large law practice, and he had an office in Washington, D.C. He handled many cases in the federal courts and was appointed Assistant Attorney General of the United States. So you can see how they would have a lot in common. Governor Frederick Holliday grew up in Winchester and graduated from Yale. He then attended the University of Virginia Law School and was admitted to the bar. He served in the Civil War and was a colonel of the 33rd Virginia Regiment of the Stonewall Brigade. In August of 1862, he was injured in a battle and his right arm was amputated. He was unable to continue in the field, so he became a member of the Confederate Congress. Then he was elected the governor of Virginia in 1877. He served for a year, was not reelected. And in 1880, he purchased Woodville from the Jifkins when they returned to Scranton. Excuse me. Now, Handley enjoyed visiting in the area, and he had this appreciation for the Confederacy. So one day, now this is a story that Mr. Eddy, who was the library director for many years, had known Conrad and other people. And so he did an oral history, and he told us some stories. And he said that Judge Handley was down visiting and was going for a ride with Holmes Conrad. And Holmes Conrad, they were riding through Mount Hebron Cemetery, which is our large community cemetery. And a part of that is the Stonewall Cemetery, where many of the Confederates are buried. So they're riding around through there, and all of a sudden Judge Handley is going, you know, I'd like to be buried here. And they said, well, small problem. This area is just for Confederate veterans. You weren't in that part of the war. But, ever being enterprising, they said, but there's an area over here where you could have a space, or several, as it turns out, and that was right adjacent to the Confederate cemetery. So he decided to purchase several lots in this area. And then he designed and created what he wanted for his mausoleum. So while he wasn't right with the Confederates, he was right next to the Confederates. And several other people buried in the cemetery were also, you know, since they survived the war, they died at later times, so he had other Confederates that were around him, so he should have felt at home and comfortable. But I thought that was very creative of them, like, well, just because you can't have this spot, we have places here. Ever enterprising and making sure that all were cared for. So they got that tended to. Now, Judge Handley thought Frederick County had a lot of potential for growth. He had been investigating what kind of ore was in the area, what else was here. And he also felt that because we were in the midst of Reconstruction and things were kind of poor, that the area needed some help. So he purchased some land, and then he was a large stockholder in the Union Bank. And he also began conferring with his buddies about his wish to do something to promote the happiness and welfare of the people of Winchester. And he wanted to purchase land and maybe even establish a public park. But Holmes Conrad thought the city would benefit more from the construction of a large modern hotel with attractive grounds that would serve as a summer resort. So Handley agreed, and in 1890, they established the Equity Improvement Company of Winchester, and it was incorporated by the General Assembly. Handley was the president, Holmes Conrad the vice president, and Charles Crum was the secretary. Handley headed the list of subscribers with a cash subscription of $50,000. Then they were going to sell stock in the company for $5 a share. A lot of it was subscribed, but it was like monthly payments. And then things kind of died down. So it was difficult to acquire the total capital stock. and Handley finally subscribed the remaining $266,000. So enthusiasm was high, and predictions were made for the increased property of the area. They purchased several tracts of land, and construction was begun on the Winchester Hotel, later called the Winchester Inn. And this was an area of Academy Lane, which is, I don't know how many people know about the old hospital, but it's off of Cork Street and then up in the corner over here towards Handley High School, around in that area, and it's called Academy Lane now. Construction was very slow, hampered by lacks of sales of the Equity Improvement Company stock. They did finish the Winchester Inn in 1891, but it remained empty for several years, and it was only open a few months, and then it closed. But the Equity Improvement Company continued even though it didn't live up to its total promise. Now, in later years, the poor judge suffered from health problems. It's thought he suffered from hay fever, which is difficult with today's medicines, and in that day and time would confine him to bed for several weeks. He hadn't been well for more than a month before his death on February 15, 1895, at age 60. The Scranton Tribune, published in February 15, said, "Ex-Judge Handley dies at 2:30 this morning at his apartment over the Merchants and Mechanics Bank at 420 Lackawanna Avenue. He was attended by his doctors, was unconscious for about an hour previous to his death, and made no last request." The Winchester Times also reported that he died from the prevailing grip, and his last words were, "If it pleases your honor, we will rest." Well, it was a great tradition at that time. Sort of instead of coming up with a great headline, you came up with a great death statement. So it's a little questionable that that was truly his final statement, but it sounds good. If you were a judge, that would be the perfect thing to say. "If it pleases your honor, we will rest." Now, with the death of the judge, there were many remarks in the newspapers about him. There was an editorial that said, "Behind the somber and almost exceedingly austere exterior secluded the real man, was a warm-hearted, high-principled gentleman with a nature as broad and sturdy as his own large physique." Now, his funeral in Scranton was held on Sunday, February 17th at St. Luke's Episcopal Church, and according to newspaper accounts, it was attended by the largest crowd in the church's history. There were many prominent people, but also a large number were the poor, many of whom Handley had assisted in their hour of need. And he had his will read to his pallbearers before the funeral. But the contents were kept secret until they probated it on Monday morning, February 18. And then on that Monday, Handley's body and a sizable funeral party set out by railway for Winchester. Now, after they had the will read to them, they did have the good sense and kindness to send a telegram to Winchester, where he had many good friends, and they let them know about the judge's death. And then they let them know about the incredible gift he was leaving, which was a real surprise for all. So Winchester Common Council held a meeting where they officially announced the Handley's death, and they had resolutions of sorrow and a committee appointed to carry out plans adopted for the public and private recognition of the sad occasion. They decided that they would close all the businesses and the schools and encourage everyone to come and line the streets. So as they carried his body from the church to the cemetery, there would be lots of people there, to observe. The hundreds who could not gain admission to the church thronged the line of procession for nearly a mile. Services were conducted at Christ Episcopal Church, and he was laid to rest in the Mount Hebron Cemetery. His funeral was one of the largest that entered the cemetery. And now the next regular meeting that they had after the judge's death was in March. The Common Council adopted a resolution honoring the judge, but the question remained, why did Judge Handley make this generous gift to the city of Winchester? He had written and signed his will 1890, prior to the incorporation of the Equity Improvement Company and the beginning of his efforts to boost business in this war-ravaged community. This was shortly after there was a bad incident in Scranton that might have had an impact on his plans. Now, in Scranton, where he owned a hotel and the churches and banks, a couple of other good places, property owners were assessed to pave Lackawanna Avenue with cobblestones. So the judge paid his share, and then, just a very short time later, there was a movement to pave the streets with asphalt, and they once again had an assessment for the property owners. And Judge Handley objected rather strenuously to this. He'd already just made these payments, and he didn't think he should have to do it twice for the same purpose. So they made the decision to pave the avenue, except for the section in front of the Wyoming house, the hotel that he owned. And then City Council decided, we need another farmer's market, and we should have it where there are cobblestones. It'd be easier to care for. So they put a farmer's market right in front of his fancy hotel. This did not go over so well. And he was not real happy with that attention to things. Now also, when he had written his will in 1890, Scranton had just received a gift of property and funds for the construction of a private library. So this might have given him some good ideas of what he could do for Winchester. Earlier in Winchester in 1883, John Kerr had left money to build a school, and the school, now called John Kerr School, just down on Cameron Street, was built. The community was growing, and Judge Handley must have seen the increased need for education of the children. And knowing himself how important it was for the education and how hard it had been to get education, he decided that he should help with that. Now, his will was long and complicated, with 29 items detailing his bequests and instructions. He gave money to places in Scranton, to Catholic institutions, and bequests to individuals, the continuation of tuition to both boys and girls that he was providing education for. He left guidelines for his executors, and he named his executors. Then he instructed that the rest and residue of his estate be given to the city of Winchester, Virginia, to be accumulated for 20 years. This income to be expended by the creation of schoolhouses for the education of the poor. And this resulted in the building of Handley School and the Douglas Colored School, and an annual contribution since 1919 towards the operation of the schools. He also gave Winchester $250,000 to be invested in the bonds of Virginia until it should amount to $50,000. Then the city shall erect, construct, furnish, and open a public library for the free use of the people of the city of Winchester forever thereafter. So we had the library to be called the Handley Library. He also wanted them not to expend or lay out more than this amount of money for the bequest for the land and the library to be erected. And should we not spend more than that money in the incomes and the balance for the library annually for the purchase of books, maps, works of art, etc., from time to time. So he didn't know quite as much about operating a library, but it was a great idea to have a library. His executors were 3 business leaders from Scranton. And the Winchester City Council and the mayor realized that this was a really big situation here, little more than just what City Council alone could handle. So they requested from the Virginia General Assembly to create the Handley Board of Trustees to receive and administer the bequest. And they were chartered February 7, 1896. 9 business leaders were elected by City Council, and the first meeting was held in 1897. Holmes Conrad was elected president. Now, lucky for us, Holmes Conrad was the most amazing lawyer, had a lot of skill and knowledge, because one of the first things that happened was there was a lawsuit brought by people who claimed to be relatives of John Handley, and who should have said, we should have been in that will. I'm sure that's what he meant. We're cousins, after all. But the case was decided in favor of the will, and then the cousins appealed. And then the Court of Appeals affirmed the decision of the lower court. So Holmes Conrad had a lot going on with all of that. They had to get all of that taken care of and sorted out. In the meantime, the money was slowly generating some interest. Well, politics changed in Winchester, And the city council was suddenly not in favor of actions taken by the Board of Trustees, and they started making efforts to dismantle them. The Board of Trustees had to file a bill of equity and ask for a judicial determination of the rights, duties, and powers of the Board of Trustees as compared to those with City Council. So once again, they're back in court, and Judge Harrison ruled on the side of the trustees. He is also asked to rule on a selection of the will that said, you can't do anything until the money builds up more interest. Now the problem is, when the judge arranged this, bonds were paying 6%, and now they were only paying 2%. And this could postpone indefinitely the building of the library. So Judge Harrison took pity on them and allowed the board to invest the net funds and move forward with plans. So the executors made the first payment finally. They're getting money from Scranton of $21,435. And then in 1902, the Board of Trustees began to purchase lots to provide the site for the library. And they authorized Major Conrad to get an architect, and that was J. Stewart Barney. So now they're selecting a building committee, and then they got the plans approved, and finally they started securing bids, and they began building the construction in 1905. In 1908, the Masons had a cornerstone laying ceremony. Work continued, and in June of 1912, they hired C. Vernon Eddy as the librarian at a salary of $1,200 a year. He went and studied with folks at Pratt Library, and the folks at Pratt Library were also helping to pick out books. Of course, they did have to wait a while, like a year, until the interest built up again so that they could begin buying books. So the building was finished. They're trying to acquire their books, and there was actually a cartoon in the city, in the Star, of Vernon Eddy sitting in a chair with his feet up on a desk, and he's got a pile of books on the desk that he's looking and reading through, and there's a pile on the left of him that are rejects, a tall pile, and then a short pile on the right of books he was actually accepting. So the paper frequently had these cartoons in there trying to push the action along a little bit. But they took it very seriously and made sure they had the opening collection of an assortment of things. And then they also decided to hire an assistant librarian. They hired Judith Gibson. Her salary was $400 a year. Being a female, I guess they thought she didn't need as much money to live on. But they finally got ready to open to the public on August 21st, 1913, 16 years after their first payment. They had a program in the auditorium, and the building was open for the people to explore, but no books were checked out until the next day. So people were in line to see who's going to get the first library card. And two little boys pushed through the line first and got the first card. And a couple of other ladies were a little excited and disappointed that they had been so rude and done that. But then the ladies received their cards, and Mr. Eddy tried to mollify them a bit. Kate McVicker was a lady who did articles in the Winchester Star, probably the first female who did articles for the Star, and she was an avid reader, and she was very disappointed. But Mr. Eddy said, "It's all right, Miss McVicker. You are the first lady to receive a card. Not a child, but the first lady." So she accepted that, was a little mollified, and thought, okay, this is good. So they started off the library with 2,300 books. Today we have many more than that, and we have 3 library buildings in the Handley regional system. Poor Mr. Conrad became ill, and he resigned as a chair of the Board of Trustees. R. Gray Williams, another prominent attorney in town, succeeded him on July 2nd, 1913. Now the library was established. The Handley Board of Trustees began to focus on collecting the remainder of property funds and interest from the executors of Handley's estate. The 20-year period of waiting concluded in February 1915. Now, the folks up in Scranton were not all that eager to sell the property and collect all the money and turn everything over. So they had to get some other lawyers involved and sort of begin pushing that along. They were afraid if they put all the property up for sale at one time, it would affect the price of things. But gradually, they began moving forward on that. The property was sold, and new money was received. But now they had to figure out, what are we going to do to meet the requirements of his will? Because the judge wanted schoolhouses for the poor. Well, what does that mean exactly? Everybody had an opinion. Some people wanted to have a college built. Other people thought industrial schools would be good. And John Kerr School, while it was kind of nice when it started, it was getting really crowded. And the city schools were starting to rent other buildings and places. But the good old city fathers were like, oh, well, we can't possibly build another school because we have this money coming from Judge Handley. It would be really very poor of us to spend city money, city tax dollars, when we're going to be getting some money. Like, it didn't really matter that they were overcrowded for over 10 years. That's irrelevant. That part would work itself out. There were private schools you could go to if you needed to. So they finally began putting these things together. And they decided to contact the General Education Board of New York. This is a charitable organization that John D. Rockefeller had started in 1902, which focused on progressive education, especially for Southern communities. So many people were interested in the effort of a private foundation and public funding for schools in Winchester. We were sort of leaders of the nation for this to happen. So the Board of Trustees had to present their plan to City Council for their approval. So for a couple of years, they went back and forth. They had consultants come in who looked at what the community was like, what our industry was like, what some of the needs were, how many people were in town, that sort of thing. And they also did a little testing of the students who were here to find out, well, what's the education level? What else are the needs? So the Board of Trustees came up with some ideas. The General Education Board came up with ideas. Then they were supposed to present their plan to City Council for their approval, because part of the agreement with the Board of Trustees was that they didn't just go off on their own tangent, just like they might want to do, even though they were important and powerful people, but they were encouraged to think ahead of what else they wanted. So on January 14, 1919, City Council approved their plan to erect and equip an educational plant of modern public school buildings for the free use of all the children in the city of Winchester, which is a great and noble idea. This was the time of segregation, so the plan included a separate site for colored children to be provided for and a school built for them. Now, the Handley Board of Trustees would provide the site, build and equip the two schools, and would hold the title to the schools, but lease them to the school board for $1 a year. Now, that's a really interesting part of it. They were going to maintain the title and then lease the school. So when we had this recent excitement going on where people were saying, oh, we need to put lights on the Handley campus, it turned out then people were kind of going, excuse me, the Board of Trustees own this building and this property. We are not sure that lights are quite the thing to do. It wasn't a school board decision. It was a Board of Trustees decision. So at the moment, we do not have extra trashy lights everywhere. Oh, I'm sorry, does that give away my feelings about that? But, you know, it was kind of an interesting concept there that the Board of Trustees would own the buildings and then lease them for $1 a year. I mean, they weren't trying to make money on this. They were just trying to make sure that they maintained control and appreciation of it. Now, the other part was going on was Judge Handley said, okay, we're going to build the schools, and then there'll be so much money will go towards the support of the schools. And for a while, one of the thoughts was, oh, gee, why don't we just use the judge's money for city education, and then we won't have to use any tax dollars ever. And they said, no, that's not quite what he was aiming for. The Board of Trustees would provide funds to the school system, but only if City Council provides at least $15,000. So they got to provide a share. So that was an interesting aspect of it as well, trying to encourage the city to, come on, it's time to pony up and be responsible for your children yourselves. So by May 1919, the trustees hired Mr. F.E. Clerk as superintendent of the Winchester Schools of the Handley Foundation. And in June, they hired Walter McCormick as an architect for the proposed school. And by December 1921, they appointed the building committee. So the Equity Improvement Company owned a lot of land in Winchester, and they opted to use some of this property for the school. People complained because the property now is out Valley Avenue, and it was on the outskirts of Winchester at that time. There wasn't a whole lot else around. And now all of a sudden they're going to build the school there, so everybody will have a long distance to walk and travel, and it just seemed very odd to a lot of people. But it was property they already owned. They didn't have to expend extra funds on purchasing the property. So things moved forward on that. And then the Masons had a cornerstone laying service, and Handley School opened for classes in September 1923. They still had construction to complete. They still used some extra buildings, but school was started, which is why this year we're having our 100th anniversary of Handley High School. So they began working on this construction. They got things pulled together. It was very exciting for the first students to be there. A Massey family conveyed a 5-acre section of land on North Kent Street, which became the site of the school for the colored children. Now, Handley gets finished in 1923. The African-American parents began petitioning the school board saying, our school is very overcrowded. We have many students who need education. It's time to follow up now and build this school for our children as well. So they finally began working on the school, and in 1927, Douglas School was completed and opened. It was initially called the Colored School, and then several years later, they gave it the name of Douglas School. But when it was first opened, it only went to the 8th grade. Students earned certificates of graduation. If they wanted to go on to high school or for a graduation degree, they had to go to Manassas to school, which generally meant living in Manassas, traveling home on the weekends. Over the next several years, additional grades were added, and in 1954, black students could graduate with a 12th grade education. 1966 was the final year of the school before integration. And then all the students were at Handley. The Handley Board of Trustees, then after the school was finished, the Handley High School, they began selling lots for houses around it. And this generated funds, which went to the support of the library and the schools. So that was one of the big jobs that the Board of Trustees had then, was assigning, accepting sales from people and allowing them to, or fixing up mortgages for them, allowing them to purchase property. And then that generated a lot of good funds. And it wasn't until 1932 that the city of Winchester provided an amount equal to the income from the Handley Fund for public schools. Now, they are doing a little bit better now. The city of Winchester is giving considerable more money for the school systems, and now the Board of Trustees has some money, which goes a little bit to the library and a little bit more to the schools, and then they have set up sort of some foundations and trusts that money goes for some special purposes. Now, the other thing that happened then was everybody was very appreciative of Judge Handley and all he had done for the community. And so at the end of the school year, when I was a student there, students would march to the cemetery and place flowers at the grave of John Handley. So you were always looking around the neighborhood to see who had early flowers growing, that you might be able to get some. And then the younger students would start marching at Washington's headquarters and then go up the hill to Mount Hebron Cemetery. Older students would start at Handley School. And we were all walking along carrying our little bouquets of flowers. And then when we got up to the cemetery, the senior boys were assigned the job of collecting the flowers and then placing them on the tomb. And then there were a few words said, and then we got our report cards. they had a few things built in there to make sure everybody participated. And nowadays, they don't do every student in the school having the march. They do some selected students who do that. And they do things now more around his date of his death, and then they do some celebrations around his birthday. So we continue to appreciate these magnificent gifts of Judge Handley, and we hold sacred his memory and appreciation of all that he did. And it's so grand to think that here's a person who never lived here, but who visited here and enjoyed the community so much that he made these gifts. So it's kind of the Judge Handley syndrome. You always want to be nice to people everywhere, whether they're visiting, whether they've lived here, because you never know who's going to be the next person to, to leave that kind of wonderful gift. And we have had many fantastic people who have made many generous gifts to a number of places in our community. And so Winchester continues to be very fortunate in all of that happening and continuing. So we are very delighted and excited. It's great to have, we've named these things after Judge Handley, so his name will continue to live in the community and people will be aware of him. So that's kind of a brief overview with lots of details that are still there to be looked at. It was a really complicated time to make everything come together, and happen. So if anybody's interested in the books and wants to read more on your own, you're welcome to. And we're very fortunate that we have Kim here. So Kim Ball has been the vice president of the Handley Celebration Board, and she has been the mastermind behind many events and activities. And she has been doing, we've had a series of talks about the book. We did one last week, and there's another one coming up next week. That'll be happening. And then on the 28th, you all are? Sunday the 28th, at the high school is going to be a celebration of Judge Handley's birthday with good things that are going on there. So that's all the thoughts that I have prepared for you all.